What would you say, in your opinion, is the most progressive part of the 2010 Constitution of the People's Republic of Kenya? The Constitution of Kenya 2010 is lauded world over to be the most progressive constitution today. But the question is, what are the parts in this constitution that are progressive? What are the parts in this constitution that sets it apart from other constitutions? And just because there are people also loving our content from different jurisdictions, I would ask, in your constitution, what would you say is the most progressive part of your constitution? If you come from Angola, Zambia, Namibia, Mozambique, Uganda, Tanzania, it really doesn't matter. From your own country, what would you say is the most progressive part of your constitution? In my opinion, and as an intellectual property practitioner with 14 years in good standing, the most progressive part of the Kenyan Constitution is the intellectual property provision. The Constitution of Kenya has set itself apart from other constitutions of its peers to have provided explicitly for intellectual property. In Kenya, intellectual property is not a good suggestion. In Kenya, intellectual property is not a good idea. In Kenya, intellectual property has constitutional safeguards that when someone plays with your IP, someone is playing with a very sacrosanct constitutional provision, the intellectual property provision. In Article 11, there are three distinct places that the Kenyan Constitution makes provision for. Allow us to begin with Article 11. Article 11 says this constitution recognizes culture as the foundation of the nation and as the cumulative civilization of the Kenyan people and nation. It's important for me to highlight that there's a huge difference between culture and tradition. This constitution recognizes tradition, but this constitution does not acknowledge tradition as to be a significant contributor of our civilization. Tradition has a point of departure with culture, in that culture is the way a people have elected to govern their day-to-day affairs. So there is culture in HR practice, there is culture in legal practice, there is culture in medical practice, there is culture in agribusiness, there is culture in fishing, there is culture in trade, and we can cascade it as we want. So the Constitution has recognized that the way we are building this space, this nation called Kenya, is on the basis of culture. So culture has that point of departure with tradition. Culture is the way a people have elected to govern their day-to-day. That is culture. Tradition, on the other hand, are the observance of a people from time immemorial. The observance bit, the rituals, the rites, and the passages, that is tradition. Culture is how we have elected to govern our affairs. We can govern our affairs on the basis of our tribes. We can govern our affairs on the basis of our professions. We can govern ourselves, and we can silo that as we want. So that is very important for us to observe, and that is very progressive. So that when you want to look at the way we are building our civilization in Kenya, then that is culture. But where I wanted us to go is Article 11, 2C. And Article 11, 2C says, the state shall promote the intellectual property rights of the people of Kenya. Why? Because that is the beginning point of culture. Culture originates from a people's intellectual uniqueness, the way our people have set up their own IP, the way the people have set up their own day-to-day. That is how we arrive at culture. It's important for us to observe that culture is tied with our civilization. So we can own aspects of our culture because aspects of our culture inform our IP. The first point of intellectual property in Kenya is not even copyright. The first point of intellectual property in Kenya is not even trademark. That one is subsequent. And that is why I've always said that whenever you're talking of copyright, trademark, patents, plant and seed varieties and the rest, you are merely talking of features of intellectual property. As far as the Kenyan constitution is concerned, the culture of the people is one of the most pronounced aspects of their IP. So that is one, culture. So I want you to understand from today, your cultural practices and your cultural expressions are your forms of intellectual property. That means that you can grow emerging industries from your cultures. You can grow emerging marketplaces from your culture and your cultural expressions and even your heritage. So that is one. The other important provision of the 2010 Constitution of the People's Republic of Kenya is what is called protection of right to property. So we have moved from culture, and we have appreciated that culture gives us that diverse heritage from which we can glean. Now, the other point which is very important is in the protection of right to property. Intellectual property is property. You might not have access to property. You might not even have access to real estate. You might not have access to tangible form of property. But Article 45 of the Kenyan Constitution attaches right to property with IP. And Article 45 says, the state shall support, promote, and protect the intellectual property rights of the people of Kenya. Why? Because your intellectual property is your form of property. The reason why we regard it as property is because intellectual property at its base has economic value. The expressions of culture at their base have economic value. When we were doing teroburu in the Luo culture, at its base, that has economic value. When we are making moratina and when we are making our indigenous alcohols and brews, that is at the base, they have economic value. So I want you to fall in love with your intellectual property, because at the end, at the base of all these forms of property, your intellectual property is a form of property. I've always told us that the reason why we call it IP is because at the base of all this IP, there is something we call property. Why is it property? Because it has economic value. I want you from today to know that way IP expresses itself in you has economic value. Your song is not intellectual property because you have copyright. No, your song is regarded as intellectual property because at the base of your song, there is economic value. Your talent is not intellectual property. The expression of that talent at its base has economic value. It is only intellectual property when you can identify the economic values that it has. That is something that I cannot overemphasize on enough. It's important that we understand we regard it as property because it has economic value. The third one, and this is very important, is did you know that intellectual property is also tied to our environment? So intellectual property begins with our culture. Intellectual property extends to our forms of property, and then intellectual property is our environment. In Article 69, where we are dealing with Part 2, Environment and Natural Resources, when you're looking at Article 69, obligations in respect of the environment, and we look at Article 69 1C. Article 69 1C says, the state shall protect and enhance intellectual property in and indigenous knowledge of biodiversity and genetic resources of the communities. There is nothing as valuable as intellectual property. Intellectual property is the greatest equalizer that the Constitution of Kenya has accorded to all of us. That today you can begin from anywhere else and rely on your intellectual property, and your intellectual property is going to equalize you in the marketplace. Your intellectual property is the greatest affirmative action in any place, because not all of us might be part of a given religion, not all of us might be part of agenda, but guess what? All of us have intellectual property. Those are three important things that if you are in Kenya, if you are someone who appears in Kenya, I want you to start knowing from today that the greatest provision you have, the greatest intellectual property provision that is constitutionally safeguarded, is that your intellectual property, as long as you're Kenyan, has those three interests. There is intellectual property in your culture. That gives you the ability that today you can set up culturally oriented businesses. You can set up culturally oriented industries and rely on intellectual property from the Constitution and get ahead. That is one. Your intellectual property is property. So when we are looking at that access that all of us have, is that access begins from an individual. Let me give you a secret. You don't need anyone's permission for you to own intellectual property. The Constitution merely acknowledges. The Constitution has not created that. The Constitution has acknowledged the existence of intellectual property. And the last one is when we are looking at the environment and the natural resources, obligations in respect of the environment, that today communities should be remunerated on the basis of their indigenous knowledge of and the biodiversity and the genetic resources of the communities. You will be amazed what we can do with that as Kenyans. The greatest document any one of us can ever have possession of is the 2010 Constitution of the People's Republic of Kenya. And if I was to go back to the original question, what is the most progressive part of the 2010 Constitution of the People's Republic? I will tell you, it is the provision on intellectual property. The state shall promote, the state shall enhance, the state shall protect your intellectual property. With your intellectual property, you can begin from where you are today, and you can end up at the most enviable place you have put for yourself. My name is Ogwang, and just in case you might wish, you might desire to be helped on what to do with your intellectual property, don't hesitate reaching out to us. Our inbox and our contact details are somewhere in our bio, and let's engage. Your intellectual property can change your life. People have begun from where you are, and they changed everything about their lives simply by relying on their intellectual property. Let me leave you with this. It is not a question of Mr. Ogwang. Does intellectual property work? The question is only one. Do you know how to work your available intellectual property? My name is Ogwang, and I want to help you work your available intellectual property. I will see you in the next one. Until then, take care. God bless. And let's not forget to interact in the comment section. Bye-bye.